and welcome to In Their Own Words, the story of the American experiment in the words of the people who made it happen. Hi, I'm your host, Pete Fenzel, and we have a fantastic episode for you today. It's the story about the American frontier, the early days. Now, the story of the frontier is such a vast topic and such an intricate, complex story that we're breaking it down into several different chapters, and each chapter will have its own episode. So for today, sit back, relax, as we present to you the episode on the American frontier, the early days. Now, back in the late 1700s, a new people evolved called Americans. They came from many ethnicities, they held dear many creeds, and bridged many cultures, and yet somehow formed into one distinct people. Americans were a migratory people, even to this day we are. And so to understand this new creation, the Americans, we need to go back and look at the migrations which formed them in the first place. Now this takes us back about 15,000 years towards the end of the last ice age. So much water had piled up in frozen glaciers that the sea level around Siberia and Alaska had dropped a few hundred feet. The result was a solid, dry landmass uniting Siberia and Alaska called Beringia. Across this land bridge, Asian people migrated into North America. But nobody knows why, but about 13,000 years ago, great migrations took place into North America. Anthropological geneticists, now that's a mouthful right there, discovered that around this time, genetic variations among these Asian migrants occurred, indicating a diaspora of these people into groups spread over large distances. And so over thousands of years, these Asian peoples would evolve into those we know as Indians. And since their bloodlines have been here exclusively for many millennia, it is fair to call them Native Americans. In the quest for food and survival, stronger tribes would displace weaker ones and in turn be displaced themselves, fighting over hunting grounds and fertile soil. Incessant conflict gave rise to warrior societies, exalting courage and prowess in combat. Meanwhile, over in Europe, dark-skinned, blue-eyed hunter-gatherers migrated from the east about 40,000 years ago. They in turn were displaced by conflict and intermarriage about 7,000 years ago with fair-skinned, brown-eyed farming people from the Middle East. And the result of the intermarriage and interactions of these two people created the first Europeans. Over the subsequent millennia, the need for fertile soil and survival prompted incessant migration all throughout Europe as stronger tribes displaced weaker ones and then in turn were displaced themselves. The Roman Empire attempted for a time to stop these migrations of Germanic tribes, but the relentless movements of these people destroyed even Rome itself. Vandals and Visigoths moved into the Iberian Peninsula and became Spaniards. Franks and Burgundians became French. Repeated invasions of the British Islands by Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, Celts, Danes, and Normans gave rise to the English, the Scottish, the Welsh, and the Irish. It was only the barrier of the Atlantic Ocean which stopped the migrations for a time. And with improvements in shipbuilding in the 16th century, the Atlantic Ocean was transformed from a barrier to a superhighway, and the migrations resumed. Visigoths and Vandals, now Spaniards, explored and then colonized South America, Central America, the Caribbean, southwestern and southern North America. Franks and Burgundians, now French, penetrated the North American continent through the St. Lawrence River and Great Lakes, claiming vast territories north and west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Spaniards, and to a lesser extent the French, adopted the Roman imperial model of colonization. They lived among and exploited the peoples they had conquered, assimilating them and relegating them to the lowest levels of the conquering society. The British model was different. Most of the tribes which had migrated into Britain had come from more barren lands in the north. They displaced the peoples who had come before them, and this model of settling conquered lands would be repeated by the British when migrations resumed. The first successful British migration was at Jamestown in Virginia in 1607. The Pilgrims established the Plymouth Plantation in 1620, and we'll hear more about them in the next episode. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, however, would involve migrations about 10 years later. The Dutch also engaged in migrations to North America. In 1626, the Dutch settled New Amsterdam at the tip of Manhattan Island. It would become New York in 1664 when the British took it from the Dutch in one of their commercial wars. One by one, additional colonies were established on the coast. This was the westernmost extent of the European frontier. Over the next 150 years, settlers would expand only to the continental divide of the Appalachian Mountains. Their transformation, however, had begun. Settling the frontier would transform the pioneers into Americans, and the pioneers would transform the frontier into America. Now consider how backbreakingly hard it was to move your family out into the wilderness, to leave your farmstead that was connected to the greater society along the Atlantic coast, to traipse over hundreds of miles utterly isolated from assistance, from protection, from resupply, having only the implements that you could stow on the backs of one or two pack horses with which to forge a new life. Consider how backbreakingly hard it was to clear land in virgin wilderness, to cut down trees and undergrowth, to create a field for farming, to build a rude cabin where your family could be warm and secure, to plow and to plant on ground that had never been broken by a plow. Consider the lawlessness of the frontier. Settlers had to right wrongs committed against themselves. Without jails or judges, vigilante justice was harsh, swift, but not always just. The frontier attracted the two extremes of society, the strongest, the bravest, the most adventurous, and the best, along with the weakest characters, the most vicious criminals, the horse thieves, the sociopaths, and those who took delight in doing evil. In the lawless backwoods, the weak and the cowardly could perpetrate all manner of wickedness and cruelty. Consider the constant fear of imminent attack by indigenous tribesmen, the constant reality of kidnapping, of torture, rape, scalping, and murder of your wife or husband, your children, and yourself. Such scenes were commonplace. Despite interludes of relative peace and rare occasions of actual friendship between Native Americans and the settlers, the relationship was one of almost unrelenting conflict. The pioneers saw the wilderness as a vast vacant place to make new lives for themselves. The Native Americans saw the settlers as threats to their way of life. Even assuming good faith by people of character on both sides, it is not surprising that lasting peace was a forlorn hope. The cultures were so alien to each other that the words never had the same meanings. Ownership to the migrating pioneers was individual to themselves. Ownership to Native Americans was a tribal matter, with land use within the tribe determined by harmonious accommodation and the stature of the individuals within the tribe. And ownership of tribal land itself was determined by the ability of the tribe to take it from another tribe and then keep it. The dark and bloody ground of Kentucky was contested by over a dozen tribes as hunting grounds, and therefore a no man's land for unrelenting warfare among them. Compounding these problems is a lack of a central governance within Native American culture. Chiefs did not have executive authority over the tribes. Their authority was persuasive based upon their personal prestige and influence over tribal opinions. But the tribe itself was not necessarily bound to follow in every way the decisions made by the chiefs. In British culture, the way that people achieved prestige and status within the community was by aristocratic birth and by the accumulation of wealth and positions of power. In Native American culture, the way that young men achieved status within their own tribes was by the taking of scalps and the stealing of horses of the tribe's enemies. Obviously, with such conflicting influences, peace was elusive at best. Now, compound this situation with people who were not necessarily dealing from positions of good faith by people of character. Consider actions by people of low character. When abuses or atrocities were committed, those who perpetrated them were seldom held accountable. They could disappear into the vast wilderness unpunished. The side that had been wronged, unable to find the perpetrators, would then exact revenge against the first person from the other side they came across. Retribution would be followed by atrocity, which would then again be followed by further retribution. And so the cycle would continue endlessly, and those who perpetrated the crimes in the first place would remain unpunished and therefore undaunted to continue with their execrable behavior unless by some chance they were subjected to some summary punishment. Now add to this mess the foreign policy machinations of France and England. Both the Native Americans and the American colonists were exploited as surrogates for these warring powers. France and England fought a global war from 1756 to 1763 called the 7 Years' War, for obvious reasons. It was fought in Europe, West Africa, India, the Philippines, the Caribbean, and North America. In America, the conflict is known as the French and Indian War because most of the Native American tribes, except for the Iroquois Confederation, allied with the French. The French were the lesser of two evils for the Native Americans. They exploited the land for fur rather than for farming. Before the French and Indian War, British North America was confined to the 13 colonies hugging the Atlantic coast and around Hudson's Bay. Aside from hunters and trappers and the rare homestead, British Americans did not settle beyond the Appalachians in French territory. But Britain won the war in 1763 and divested France of its territories in North America. French territory west of the Mississippi became Spanish, and all French territory east of the Mississippi became British. The lands beyond the Appalachians were now open to settlement, the one thing native tribes feared most. And so a loose confederation of the tribes who were former French allies under joint leadership, most notably of the Ottawa chieftain Pontiac, not to be confused with the Pontiac chieftain, combined to eradicate British presence west of the mountains. Of the 11 British forts and their dependent settlements in the Great Lakes and lands north of the Ohio River, all were wiped out to the last man, woman, and child, except for Fort Detroit, Fort Pitt, which is Pittsburgh, and Fort Niagara. The consternation in London was extreme. Britain was bankrupt from the 7 Years' War and could not fund another Indian war in North America. So, making a virtue of necessity, King George III, not to be confused with Boy George, issued a proclamation to mollify the rebellious tribes. In the proclamation of 1763, the king commanded that American colonists were not to settle west of the Appalachian Divide. The lands on the western side of the mountains were reserved exclusively for Native Americans. The tribes recognized the proclamation for the cynical ploy it was, but the rebellion collapsed in the face of British military successes the following year. The proclamation line outraged the colonists, who then ignored it as a temporary stratagem to pacify the warring tribes. Subsequent British treaties a few years later would push the settlement line much farther west, but the damage was done. The British Crown had proved itself adverse to the American colonists. Its persistent pattern of exploitation and abuse would lead to revolution. In fact, the first American settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains was an effort to escape tyrannical and corrupt royal government. Around 1769, pioneers mostly from North Carolina came down the Holston Valley to the Watauga River near Sycamore Shoals in what is now northeastern Tennessee. More families arrived there in 1771, and the following spring, the settlers formed an autonomous egalitarian community called the Watauga Association. Quickly, they adopted a written constitution-like agreement under which the settlers would conduct themselves with familiar American guarantees of individual liberties, and with each of the 5 settlements electing a representative to a governing body which both administrated and acted as a court. But this was a settlement, not a migration. The first western migration by colonists would be to Kentucky. Kentucky was the uninhabited no man's land of warfare among the competing tribes. But it was an Eden teeming with buffalo and elk and deer and smaller game. For millennia, buffalo and other animals had trampled miles of wide-open paths to salt licks, which abounded in the region, and salt was essential to preserve meat. Open meadows and standing forests provided all that was needed for homesteads and farms. And trappers and long hunters like Daniel Boone, not to be confused with singer Pat Boone, brought word of this paradise called Kentucky to those living in western North Carolina and Virginia. But settlers needed a way to get through the vast mountain barrier. At the point where Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia meet, there is an opening through the Appalachian Mountains called the Cumberland Gap. Now, over thousands of years, wild game would pass through the gap, trampling a path to the salt licks up in Kentucky. For many generations, bands of warriors would use these traces, extending them up into the Ohio country, to attack enemy tribes. This became known among Native Americans as the Warrior's Path. In 1769, Daniel Boone scouted the Warrior's Path up into the bluegrass country of Kentucky. To him, it was heaven on earth. He returned to his home in the Yadkin Valley of North Carolina, but made several more scouting long hunts into Kentucky. Boone's first attempt to settle in Kentucky was an absolute disaster. In September of 1773, Boone led his family and about 60 people through the Cumberland Gap up into Kentucky. They went into camp in Powell's Valley. Now, about a day behind him, Boone's 16-year-old son James and his 17-year-old friend Henry Russell and 3 other men followed with pack animals carrying flour and farming implements. Well, on the morning of October 10, 1773, a Shawnee raiding party attacked the smaller group. All were killed, but before their deaths, the boys were subjected to horrific tortures. And when Daniel Boone came upon the remains of his son, he could not distinguish James from Henry, but for some remnants of their clothing. This event so disheartened the pioneers that they abandoned Kentucky and returned to their homes in the Yadkin Valley. Now, trappers and long hunters and surveyors would still roam throughout Kentucky, and they would eventually be followed by migrating settlers. And it was Lord Dunmore's war which would provide that opportunity. On May 3rd of 1774, a group of Virginians attacked and murdered a peaceful and innocent group of Cayuga, among whom were the mother and the wife of the Cayuga war chief Logan. Now, Logan had been a friend of the settlers before this, but the murder of his mother and his wife changed everything. Leading the Cayuga on a rampage throughout western Pennsylvania and Virginia, they murdered and destroyed everyone and everything in their paths. This expanded into a general war among all the tribes against settlement west of the mountains. Shawnee war chief Cornstalk ravaged the Ohio country and western Virginia. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, was widely accused by Virginians of inciting this war to decimate the Virginia militia, which would support the growing rebelliousness of the colony against British royal power. If that were the case, his scheme failed dramatically on October 10th, 1774, at the Battle of Point Pleasant, at the confluence of the Ohio River and the Kanawha River in what is now West Virginia. There, 1,100 Virginian militiamen met an equal number of Native Americans and decisively beat the Native Americans, thus prompting the tribal leaders to sue for peace. An imperfect peace resulted for about 2 years, which gave time and the opportunity for the settlement of Kentucky. Into our story now steps Richard Henderson, not to be confused with Superman's friend, Inspector Henderson. Richard Henderson was a land speculator from North Carolina with grandiose plans to start a 14th American colony in Kentucky out of lands he would purchase from the Cherokee. With the relative peace resulting from Lord Dunmore's war, Henderson met with Cherokee leaders down in Sycamore Shoals to purchase a large tract of land in Kentucky. The protracted negotiations with Cherokee Chief Oconostota concluded on March 17, 1775, and the result was an entirely irregular and unlawful treaty purporting to purchase from the Cherokee all the land bounded by the Kentucky River on the east, the Cumberland River on the south, and the Ohio River on the north and west. Henderson intended to name this 14th colony Transylvania, not to be confused with that other Transylvania. While negotiations were progressing, Henderson retained Daniel Boone to lead a party of 30 axemen to clear a path for settlers through the Cumberland Gap to a chosen site along the Kentucky River. Following the first warrior's path, Boone and his men blazed a trail wide enough for pack horses and cows to traverse up to the site selected. That trail is known as Boone's Trace. Twice, Boone and his axemen were attacked en route by Shawnee, losing 2 men killed. They arrived along the Kentucky River on April 1st, 1775. And Richard Henderson and his assemblage of prospective settlers were 19 days behind Boone. Now, as the axemen worked to build a protective enclosure for themselves along the Kentucky River, Daniel Boone sent the following message to Henderson: "Your company is desired greatly, for the people are very uneasy, but are willing to stay and venture their lives with you. Now is the time to flusterate intentions, and to keep the country whilst we are in it. If we give way to them now, it will ever be the case. Come and send, as soon as possible, D. Boone." Meanwhile, Richard Henderson, still in the Holston Valley and stuck in a spring blizzard, received Boone's letter on April 7th. A young man in Henderson's company, William Calk, kept a journal of the expedition to the Kentucky River. Henderson's company would arrive at Boone's camp on the Kentucky River on April 20th, which is recorded in the journal. Wednesday, 19th. Smart frost this morning. They killed 3 buffaloes about 11 o'clock. We come to where the Indians fired on Boone's company and killed 2 men and a dog and wounded 1 man in the thigh. We camped this night on the Otter Creek. Thursday, the 20th. This morning is clear and cool. We start early and get down to Kaintuck to Boone's Fort about 12 o'clock, where we stop. They come out to meet us and welcome us in with a volley of guns. Now numbering almost 80 men, the new Transylvania settlers got to work to construct a fort for defense. This was typical of frontier forts, rectangular with corner bastions to enfilade and shoot down upon the enemy. The back walls of log cabins were incorporated as part of the timber stockade, and they named the new settlement Boonsboro. Once measures for defense were accomplished, the 4 settlements in Kentucky came together to Boonsboro under a large elm tree to form a rudimentary government. Those 4 settlements were Boonsboro, Harrodsburg, Logan Station, and Crab Orchard. Among the measures adopted were guarantees of freedom of religion, establishment of courts, prohibition of profane swearing, an act to preserve the breeding of horses. After all, this is Kentucky. And the last provision was an act to preserve game from overhunting. Now, the irony of this last provision enacted on the Native American hunting grounds apparently was lost on Richard Henderson. In June, Boone returned to his North Carolina home in time to witness the birth of a daughter. She died a week later. In October, the bereft Boone family packed up and left for Boonsboro. They took the Wilderness Road through the Cumberland Gap and up to their new home in Boonsboro, accompanied by about 60 neighbors, families who sought a new life in the paradise of Kentucky. Over the next few decades, over 200,000 pioneers would migrate through the Cumberland Gap on the Wilderness Road on Boone's Trace up into Kentucky. The following year, 1776, would see the independence of the United States and the resumption of warfare on the frontier. British agents would influence Native American tribes to resume their attacks upon settlements and homesteads, and total war resulted on the frontier. Settlers had already created a new society of Americans on the frontier where aristocracy held no place, where straightforward simplicity was compelled by nature, where people were judged by what they did and what their character displayed, and where rugged individualism was inextricably tied to a commitment to the common good. Survival demanded that it be so. Every moment was filled with mortal peril, and every moment reinforced the character of these harsh, grim, courageous, resourceful, industrious, and devout people. With the settlement of Kentucky, the United States extended all the way to the banks of the Mississippi River. But that's a story to be told in another episode. So we're going to suspend our discussion of the story of the American frontier right here. Now, to you younger Americans of all backgrounds, know this. The frontier is in your bones too. It is in your national DNA. And all you have to do is to dig down into yourselves a little bit to discover the courage, the resourcefulness, the industriousness, and the devotion you need to change the world. So, start digging. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, would you please share it with your children, with your family, with your friends, and share on social media as well if you would. And we always welcome some feedback that helps us stay in the right direction. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. God bless you.